The old brick radio station sat on the outskirts of town, nestled between the skeletal remains of forgotten industry and a dense, decaying forest. Its large frosted windows were etched with grime, streaks from long-ago rains that had beaten the glass but never been wiped away. The road leading to the station was cracked and overgrown with weeds, a narrow ribbon of neglect. WKTH 99.7 FM, the voice of nowhere, or so the faded neon sign proclaimed, flickering sporadically in the night. Inside the station was a relic, untouched by modernity. The walls were lined with dusty vinyl records and faded concert posters from bands that had long since broken up or been forgotten. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and mildew, and the hum of outdated equipment filled the silence. The control room was dimly lit, casting long, eerie shadows across the rows of unused soundboards and reel-to-reel tape decks. It felt less like a place of work and more like a crypt, a mausoleum for a dying art. Johnny slouched in his chair, feet propped up on the desk, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping a half-empty coffee mug. His reflection in the thick glass of the studio window was barely visible, a vague, shadowy figure blurred by years of neglect. The glow of his control panel flickered, illuminating his grizzled face. The lines of exhaustion etched deep into his skin, his eyes red-rimmed and vacant. He'd been doing the late-night shift at WKTH for too long, speaking to the void, wondering if anyone still listened at all. The familiar red on-air sign flickered to life above him, buzzing softly, and Johnny straightened up in his chair. He cleared his throat, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes and late nights.
Hey, good evening, night owls. It's Johnny Q, keeping you company as the hours get small. You know the drill. Call in, tell me what's on your mind. Or just sit back, relax, and let the music carry you through the night.
His voice crackled through the empty airwaves drifting out into the void. He leaned back, eyes half closed, already preparing for another night of nothing. It wasn't like the old days when people would call in, request songs, tell him about their days. Now it was just silence. Maybe a prank or two if he was lucky, but for the most part, the world had moved on. Radio had moved on. And Johnny had been left behind, tethered to a dying station, a ghost at the controls. The minutes ticked by, the low hum of static the only sound in the room. Johnny rubbed his eyes, glancing at the clock. It was just past midnight. He sighed, reaching for his mug, only to pause as the phone rang, its sharp trill cutting through the silence. Johnny sat up, surprised. His hand hovered over the receiver for a moment before he picked it up.
WKTH, you're on the air,
he said, his voice rough but steady. For a moment there was only static, then a voice. A man, shaky and distant, crackled through.
Something terrible is happening.
Johnny's brow furrowed. The voice was faint, distorted by static, but there was a distinct note of panic in it. He adjusted the volume, trying to hear more clearly.
Hey, buddy, you're coming in real low. Can you repeat that? What's going on?
There are fires, explosions, the sky.
The voice cut out again, lost in a hiss of static. Johnny frowned.
Where are you calling from? What's happening?
There was a long pause, just the faint sound of crackling static on the other end. Then the voice returned, more frantic, more desperate.
It's everywhere! On the ground! Splitting apart! People are...
The line went dead. Johnny stared at the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He sat there for a long moment, gripping the receiver, listening to the dial tone buzz in his ear. Another prank call, he thought, but the fear in that man's voice felt too real, too visceral. He hung up, shaking his head.
All right, folks. Seems like we've got someone out there trying to give us a good scare tonight. Hope you're all safe and sound. Let's not let this spooky season get the better of us.
Johnny tried to laugh it off, but the unease had already settled deep in his gut. Something about that call didn't sit right. He reached for his laptop, pulling up a local news site, scrolling through the headlines. Nothing. No reports of fires, no earthquakes, no disasters. Everything seemed normal. And then the phone rang again. Johnny hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver. Slowly, he picked it up, bringing it to his ear.
WKTH, you're on the air.
This time it was a woman's voice, trembling, on the verge of hysteria.
Johnny! Oh God, Johnny, you have to help us!
Johnny's throat tightened.
Ma'am, calm down. What's going on?
There's just no way out. The roads, they're nothing but cracks. Fires everywhere. People are trapped. There's no escape. I don't know what to do.
Her voice broke into ragged breaths, and Johnny's pulse quickened.
Where are you? What's your location?
It doesn't matter. Help me die.
The woman's voice dissolved into static, and the line went dead again. Johnny slammed the phone down, his heart racing. He reached for his phone, dialing the emergency services. The call didn't even connect, just more static. He tried the number again. Nothing. The low hum of the station buzzed louder in his ears. He stood up, pacing the small control room, running a hand through his hair. The air felt heavier, thicker, like it was pressing down on him. The flickering lights above buzzed, casting an unnatural glow on the worn-out equipment. He had to be imagining things, just stress or maybe the late nights finally catching up with him. But then the phone rang again. This time, Johnny hesitated longer, his hand trembling as he reached for the receiver. He picked it up slowly, bringing it to his ear.
WKTH.
His voice trailed off. Silence. Then, a whisper, so faint it was barely audible, but unmistakable. Johnny. He froze. The voice wasn't panicked like before. It was cold, detached, like a breath on the back of his neck. Johnny, it's too late. His blood ran cold. He gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white.
Who is this?
You already know. You've always known. The line went dead. Johnny dropped the phone, his heart hammering in his chest. He stumbled back, his vision blurring as the room seemed to close in on him. The lights flickered again, the hum of the equipment growing louder, more distorted. He could hear it now, a low, droning buzz like a swarm of flies or the beating of distant wings. He turned toward the window and his breath caught in his throat. The reflection in the glass was wrong. His own image stared back at him, but the room behind him was dark, too dark, as if it was swallowing the light, and his reflection wasn't him. It was smiling, lips curling up into a slow, malicious grin, even as Johnny stood frozen in terror. The lights flickered once more, and then the power cut out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Johnny stumbled back, crashing into the desk, his hands shaking. The hum was louder now, deafening, filling the air with a horrible buzzing noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The phone rang again. The sound was wrong, distorted, slower, deeper, as if it were echoing up from the depths of the earth. Johnny stared at the phone, his heart thudding in his ears. He didn't want to answer it. He couldn't answer it. But his hand moved anyway, almost of its own accord, lifting the receiver to his ear. Johnny, you're already dead. His breath caught in his throat. You've been dead for a long time, Johnny. This broadcast, this station, it's all that's left of you. A ghost in the machine. Johnny's mouth went dry. His grip tightened on the receiver, his knuckles turning white. "You're trapped here, Johnny. Just like the rest of us." The lights flickered back on, but the room wasn't the same. The control boards were old, decayed, covered in layers of dust. The posters on the walls were faded, curled at the edges, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The on-air sign above him buzzed weakly, flickering once, twice, and then going out for good. Johnny stumbled back, his chest tightening as the full weight of it hit him. No one was listening. No one ever had been. And now he knew the truth. He never would leave that studio. He would never be anything more than a ghost, fading, forgotten, forever calling into the void.